Good evening and welcome to UPARS Los Angeles. My name is Steve Murillo. I am the director for UPARS LA. This is October 2018 and we have a very special guest with us tonight. His name is Matthew Mordovanec. Hopefully I got that right. And he's the creator of the YouTube channel Mattsquatch Presents. And this is how I came to know Matt. It's a great YouTube channel. If you are not familiar with Sasquatch, the subject of Sasquatch or Bigfoot, I highly recommend that you tune into his YouTube channel, Mattsquatch Presents, and just watch the videos. You will learn so much about Sasquatch that you did not know. I mean, how many people here believe in Sasquatch? Shoot, just about everybody. Okay, never mind. Why are we doing this? No, but okay, so you guys know that a couple of years ago, Alex and I were up in Trout Lake, Washington, and we came across a track, and that kind of opened my mind to the possibility of Bigfoot. You would not think that a guy that believes in UFOs needs his mind pried open to believe in Sasquatch, but I didn't believe in Sasquatch back then, and I just thought it was just some sort of little, wives' tale or whatever, just something fun that people like to toss around. But so tuning into Matt's YouTube channel, I learned quite a bit about it, and then I really started to get into the research, and I've come to find out these creatures are very, very real. They're not necessarily the friendliest, but although there have been people who've had friendly encounters, and I'm sure you're going to hear about all that tonight. So Matt was born and raised in Orange County. He's from Tustin, and I know there's one person here from Tustin, California. In his early 20s, he held a security job working in an office building complex down there in Irvine, and he might mention a little bit about that, but he told me tonight that the shapes of the buildings, he was having paranormal activity around these buildings that he and his coworkers were experiencing. They built these buildings in the shapes of pentagrams and things like that, and you can only discover that by looking down from, say, a high spot, and Matt might talk a little bit about that. So he's telling me about walls groaning and talking to him, other weird things that were happening to people, so he might talk about that a little bit. But tonight he's going to talk about Bigfoot. Let's see. He got into this. His mother has a degree in anthropology, so Bigfoot was always a topic for them to discuss, and it kind of opened his mind at a very, very early age to think about that as a possibility. He's gone to all the conferences. He's spoken to the biggest names, Bob Gimlin, just everybody. And he's also spent quite a bit of time in the woods, and that's probably what the clincher is, and you're going to hear about his encounters tonight. So I think I've taken enough of your time. Let's bring up the man of the hour, Matt Mordovanec.
Good evening. So, Steve is 100% right. It is all connected. Everything in the paranormal world, from people who ghost hunt, people who are into UFOs, people who are into Bigfoot. And if you're into this long enough, you start to look at everything. And you do realize that there's stories and accounts and things that can't be explained. But then you look at other genres, other areas of this subject that we call paranormal, and you realize a lot of it is tied together. And for the record, it's kind of funny how he was saying, for a guy who believes in UFOs, Bigfoot, that must be a bunch of BS. It's funny, from all the Bigfoot people, we're like, those UFO guys are crazy. UFO people are weird, but no, it's, a lot of us are. A lot of the Bigfoot world, we really are into conspiracies, because Bigfoot is a great subject. Especially if you're just kind of getting your feet wet in the paranormal world, it's a great subject, because there's one hell of a government cover-up going on. There's great stories of violent encounters, scary encounter, campfire-type encounters, and then there's some surprisingly compassionate stories. There's scientific stuff. There's evidence all over the world found of some form of Bigfoot on every continent except Antarctica, which wouldn't surprise me if they found one in Antarctica somewhere, eating penguins, I guess. So it is all tied together. I primarily focus on North America. I'm friends online with people who have YouTube channels that study the Yowie in Australia. I've got a really big Australian following for some reason, and those guys are crazy. They want to come. They were like, "Oh, we're going to come visit you next year, mate. We're going to go out drinking and look for Bigfoot." And I'm like, "All right." So, but Australia has their Yowie, the Eastern Europe going into Russia, they have the Almost or Almosti. China has the Yeren. Africa has the billy ape and a lot of other different types of subspecies. South America has their version of it. Going all the way up to the frozen north, there's different versions of it. And we're going to talk about the ones primarily in North America here. So I saw he already asked one of the questions I was going to ask, how many people believe in Bigfoot? But if we throw that question out for a second, can I get a show of hands of how many people have experienced something strange in the woods? A few people? Yeah, and one thing I've noticed about Bigfoot when you're doing your research, and from my own personal experience, is you can dress yourself up in camouflage, cover yourself in cover scent, smear mud all over yourself, strap GoPro cameras to yourself, and go crawl around in the bushes for 3 days and not find anything. Maybe you'll find a stick structure or something, very passive evidence. Then you go back to the house and take a shower, and you're cooking hot dogs and you're having a beer on the porch, and you hear a knock off in the distance. Then you hear howls that aren't coyote howls, and you're just like, well, what was I doing all day? Paranormal, if you guys are familiar with Skinwalker Ranch, I'm sure you guys are, it's that same kind of scenario. I always liken it to Zen, the great Zen masters. The harder you try to concentrate to get to a Zen point of view, the further away you're going to get. And there seems to be a lot of that in a Bigfoot. So when I go on quote-unquote expeditions, there's times that I try really hard and go exploring, and there's other times where you just kind of relax, kind of take it in, listen. What you don't hear is more important sometimes. When the birds go quiet and the frogs stop, and you just barely hear the grass rustling, and you're in this big giant canyon and everything's quiet. That's when it's creepy. That's when everything's like, okay, what's going on in the woods? And some of my personal experience with the woods is I do a lot of research in the Sierras. My father-in-law got blessed to be married to a wonderful woman whose dad owns 15 acres of a little ranchette in the Sierras in Tulare County. It's just outside of Sequoia National Park. And spent a lot of time up there because I've been married 9 years. We've been together longer than that. So we're going up there a long time, shooting and fishing and hunting. If you guys aren't hunters, I completely get it. I'm not much of a hunter either, just more like to go up there and just shoot guns and hang out kind of stuff. But then as my love of Bigfoot grew and you start looking at it, you're like, wow, there's a lot of encounters up here. Then you start looking at the place where we go called Battle Mountain, and you read about there was a big cavalry battle where a bunch of Native Americans had this big battle. And then you hear about ghost lights, and then you hear about other strange stuff going on, and you're like, wow, there's more than just Bigfoot. Then you're like, all right, I've got access to a cabin in the middle of the woods that has all this cool stuff going on. So that's where a lot of my research is done. Like I said, it's just outside of Sequoia National Park. There's a lot of really famous encounters in the Southern Sierras. It's a great place to go. And it's just outside of Springville, which is a tiny little town. You're probably like, Springville, where's that? And it's just east of Porterville, and you're probably like, where the hell's Porterville? So it's a tiny little town, just little farmlands and communities. You feel like you're in a different state. It does not feel like California. And that's kind of an awesome thing. If any of you guys are familiar with the Hairy Man cave paintings, the classic cave paintings that are between, I just did a video on it. They're between 1500, they're between 500 and 2,000 or 2,500 years old. These cave paintings that depict the family of Sasquatch is just a stone throw away from where I do my Bigfooting, and I didn't even know that until years later. So yeah, that's where a lot of my experience comes from up there. My dad also has a place in Idlewild, California, in Pine Cove, and I've had a couple encounters up there, some very strange things. And also Big Bear, if you guys are familiar with Big Bear. It seems like Big Bear is kind of populated, how big of a mountain can it be? But if you look at topographical maps, if you look at the GPS maps of a lot of these local mountains, you realize there's a lot of range and a lot of areas where people don't go, where a large hominid, ape-like species could possibly make a living. And if you spend enough time up there, you realize there's a lot more water and food sources than everything else. So it's a little bit of an introduction. Steve is kind of throwing a lot out there about some other paranormal stuff that I was into in the past. But when you start looking into this thing, everybody thinks of Bigfoot. 7, 8, 10, on the upwards, absolutely huge range of 12 foot long, 5, 6 feet wide at the shoulders, just the biggest, giantest brute of an ape that is also what we like to call like a forest ninja. They can be stealthy, they can be elusive, they can survive. They are absolutely incredible. And I will tell you they're very true. It is very true that they exist and they are here. And it's also fascinating when you start looking beyond Bigfoot and just start looking at every patch of woods across of America, every canyon, every little area has its ghost story, has its booger man, has its boogeyman, has its demon or its devil, like Ape Canyon, you know, a famous Ape Canyon. Well, it was called Ape Canyon before the famous Bigfoot attack ever happened there. It's like, well, what's in a name, you know? And there's a lot of that, even in Orange County where we are, off of Ortega Highway, which I'll talk about a little bit later. They have sightings. They have sightings of Bigfoot there, and you're like, no way. They have sightings all around across the border, down by Mexico, in the middle of the desert. There's a tradition in the Palm Desert called the Yucca Man, which was this blonde Bigfoot that ran around out there, and it was out there by the Marine Base 29 Stumps, and the guards would see this big, 8, 9, 10-foot tall thing run by in the middle of the night. Very scary. But anyway, so when you start looking into this subject, you start to realize people are kind of reporting something different. Some people describe it looked just like a Neanderthal man, like you would see like on a Discovery Channel, but way bigger. Then other people say, it looked like an upright walking gorilla. It had a very gorilla ape-like face. And then other people said, oh, it looked like a chimpanzee. It had its hands in the air and it was all excitable and made chimpanzee sounds. And you're like, I think we're talking about something different. And then you realize there's a lot of similarities, there's a lot of crossovers. And that's why I'm going to talk to you tonight. The Bigfoot community is kind of broken down, and it's kind of very area specific. People, different parts of the country are seeing a version of Sasquatch that may or may not be like what you're thinking in your head. So we'll get started here. This map here is I don't know how accurate it is, because if it was me putting this map together, it would just be one big red blob. Because they're literally seen in every state except Hawaii, and Hawaii has its own weird traditions of little things that run around. Florida is really packed, the East Coast. Everybody associates Sasquatch with the Pacific Northwest. And for me, when you see areas like in the center part of the country above Texas, the Midwest, where you see a lot of blank, and especially in like Montana and Idaho, in those areas where you'd think there would be a lot of Sasquatch, well, there is. It's just there's not as many people. In order to have a sighting, you got to have somebody see it. And it's my experience in talking to people. My dad is like one of these people. My mom and my dad are like completely different. My mom's like, I believe in Bigfoot, I believe in all this stuff. And my dad's just like, son, aren't you wasting your time with this? And he's actually opened up quite a bit, which is good. But there's a lot of people, they've gone their whole life. They're in 50s, 60s, their kids are grown. They think they've seen it all. They spent their whole life in the woods. Sasquatch, yeah, maybe in some parts, but not here. They're driving home in the middle of the night, and something big, hairy runs across the road. They can't explain it. Maybe they keep quiet about it. That guy had a sighting, but he's not going to call the BFRO. He's not going to call Sasquatch Chronicles and talk about it. He's not going to share that. So I have a ratio of like for every one sighting, there's probably 100 people who saw something. Because I talk to people all the time who had Bigfoot encounters. Like, you've ever reported it to any of the bigger Bigfoot organizations? They're like, no. I'm like, okay, well, you're a sighting that wouldn't be on a mass-produced map like this. So these things are indeed everywhere. And when you start looking at these creatures in the Bigfoot world, one thing that comes across in the Bigfoot world right away is they talk about the 4 basic types. And this is a pretty common type thing. I didn't know how this was going to turn out on a screen, so it might be kind of hard to see, but I'm going to describe them in detail. The 4 basic types, we're going to jump into each one, but there's the type 1s. These are your big patty types. These are the really big guys. I like to compare the 4 basic types to bears. I do a lot of bear comparison because they're also a large, fairly intelligent mammal that roams the woods, that needs to eat, sleep, drink, and poop, all the stuff that you think a Bigfoot would need to do. And the type 1s, these are your really big ones. These are your classic, the Patterson-Gimlin film, the classic big giant ones that get 11, 10, 12 feet tall. They have a very ape-like appearance. They look like someone stretched out a gorilla or took a gorilla and a human and pumped them up on steroids, and that's what they look like. The type 2s are a lot more chimpanzee-like. You get a lot of these in the South. And they're a lot more excitable, a lot more aggressive, where the type 1s are a lot more passive. Like that's what we have here, like in the Sierras. I think when you're talking Bigfoot in Idlewild or Big Bear and the local mountains and kind of going over to Arizona where the Mogollon Monster is, the Mogollon Rim around the Grand Canyon, they have a great Bigfoot tradition of very aggressive Bigfoots around the Grand Canyon. I think they're all kind of type 2s. Then you get into, and those are your two most common, like 90% of the Bigfoot reports are going to be like a type 1 or a type 2. It's like, did it look like a gorilla or did it look like a chimpanzee? Or did it look more human? The third type is incredibly rare. It's mostly along the Missouri River Basin and it has a protruding snout. And they are very nasty. One of their nicknames, some people call them a gugwe, which is a native word, not a very good word. They also call them face eaters, if that gets a little more descriptive for you. Some of the reports of these things I'll share with you later. And then the type 4s are slightly controversial because they have a lot more human-like appearance. It's often been associated, now I don't mean this in any kind of an offensive way, but this is the way that other people have described it, that they almost have kind of a, like a slight Down syndrome look to them. Or they have like a human face, but maybe with some throwback features, or they have kind of they're like a human face, but you wouldn't call them pretty by any type of an aspect. And they generally get around the same size as a type 1. And there's a lot of conjecture if a type 4 with a human face is really just a type 1 without the facial hair. But we're going to get into it. We're going to show you more pictures. But that's the 4 basic types. And when I got into this years ago, this was kind of like a groundbreaking thing, the 4 types. And it really is a good baseline. Then you start looking at accounts and reports, and you start looking at native traditions, and then you start looking at local legends, and then you start looking at what photographic evidence we have, which we do have. We do have video evidence. I love when people say, especially on my YouTube channel, oh, this is great, this is all conjecture. There's not one shred of evidence for Bigfoot. I'll give you any bit of evidence you want. You want DNA evidence, you want footprints, you want handprints, do you want video, do you want stills, do you want tens of thousands of eyewitness reports, you want hair samples, you want scat? What do you want? But people say there's no such thing, which always just means they haven't looked into it enough. So the type 1, the most common one, is the type 1. These are the Patterson-Gimlin film, like you see the still here. These are the big guys from the Pacific Northwest going on up into Canada. They have probably one of the most tolerance for colds. The type 2s we're going to talk about, they kind of don't get in that cold of weather. Sasquatch, from what I've heard, has no problem tromping through the snow in a blizzard. They just, I don't know what force drives them, otherworldly or animalistic, but they tromp through the snow, they do it all. And type 1s are probably your most basic type, the type that everybody thinks of. You think of beef jerky, Bigfoot is kind of like what you think of. And they get very big, and I always liken them to a grizzly bear. Grizzly bear being bigger than a black bear, capable of being dangerous, just like, that's how I tell people about Sasquatch. If people come up to me and they say, Sasquatch is an animal of love, and they're nothing but beauty, I'm like, okay. And then I have other people say, damn dirty apes, kill them all. And I'm like most things like wolves or bears or anything else, or chimpanzees can be very brutal, same thing with mountain gorillas and everything else. The truth lies somewhere in the middle, you know, you only poke the bear so much, you don't go near a bear with cubs, everybody knows that. And Bigfoot's much less the same. So these guys are your really big ones. If you're going to go out in the woods and do the not finding Bigfoot stuff, finding Bigfoot, and clack on rocks and trees and do the big long howls and go out there with flashlights and a camera crew and wonder why you're not getting anything, I think that's pretty self-evident. These guys are probably your most tolerant guys. They have huge, massive chests, and they're giant animals, so they have huge vocal cords. There's a lot of theories about their vocalizations, but that's a whole other subject to get off into. But they have huge, just giant, powerful. They're like the biggest ones, the quintessential Bigfoot, the ones that, take 6 foot, like 6-inch diameter trees and twist them and snap them in half. But these are a little more shy and gentle. Probably the most shy and gentle ones of the Bigfoot world are the type 1s, the big Patterson-Gimlin types. But I'll tell you right now, they will kill you and eat you. They can. They are quite capable. They are meat eaters. They're just as capable of eating plants and digging up everything else and eating crayfish or whatever they can find. But just like a bear, if it's in the woods and it hasn't eaten in a while and you've provoked it, or maybe even not, a lot of bear attacks are unprovoked. They'll eat you. So will these guys. I think that's where a lot of the missing 411 cases come from, and I'll tell you right now, I don't think all of David Pilates, in fact, I think only a smaller percentage of missing 411 is a Bigfoot or a cryptid type creature, but I do think in some cases this is a prime suspect here. Now, if we go to the next slide, all right, it's supposed to play the Patterson-Gimlin film, but for some reason it is not working right now. All right, well, the Patterson-Gimlin film, oh, see, it's playing up there, but not on here. See, it's stuff you don't know until you're in front of a live audience, that doesn't play on my little screen. But yeah, this is the classic, this is M.K. Davis's version. If you guys are familiar with M.K. Davis, he's a Bigfoot, cryptid research guy, fairly famous. He's one of the big names out there. And this is the original unstabilized footage of what Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin found in Northern California at Bluff Creek in 1967. I met Bob Gimlin at the International Bigfoot Conference, and he is the nicest, most honest, straightforward guy. And at 85 years old and 110 pounds, I'm still deathly afraid of him. He is a pretty cool old cowboy. And here you have is M.K. Davis. He's got it slowed down. He's got it kind of enhanced to show you, this is what I say when I say a type 1. And out of all the luck in the world, we filmed a female. And I've talked to Dr. Jeff Meldrum, I've talked to Dr. Bendernagel before he passed this year. I've worked with a lot of other YouTubers that talk about Patterson-Gimlin film. It's still one of the best pieces of evidence that we have. Partly because it was kind of before there was a big cover-up going on, but that was a whole nother thing, you know. But if you look at the proportions, the arm length, the knee length, where the waist is, if you zoom in and see hair follicles moving, that's no suit. It can't be a guy in a suit. You couldn't put arm extensions because, you know, you could put arm extensions on your forearm, but you couldn't put them back up. There is no way, impossibility, they've tried to reproduce it a bunch of times, is that a man in a suit. That is a real Sasquatch you were seeing right there. The proportions, you could never do it. Even with top technology, if you had some anatomical robot that could walk, you couldn't replicate its walk. The bone structure is different in their feet. The track cast that they got from this individual Bigfoot from the area also corresponds with that. And it's absolutely amazing footage. There's a lot of great breakdowns and a lot of cool stuff out there. So guys, you check it out, the Patterson-Gimlin film. It's no way it's a guy in a suit. People ask me, oh, show me a Bigfoot. Well, we got one 50 years ago. And if you talk to Bob Gimlin, it's very fascinating because you're like, because when he rode up on that Bigfoot, it was him and Bob Gimlin and Roger Patterson. They rode up on horses and they saw Patty. They call her Patty because the Patterson-Gimlin film, her. And they saw her and they couldn't believe it. That's why the beginning of it's so scratchy and weird because it's a little handheld crank camera back in the 60s when it was a real primitive filming. And he just started filming and he just started going at it because he wasn't expecting to find it. And meanwhile, Bob Gimlin, in the next horse over, was starting to pull his rifle out very slowly. And he had his rifle out. And he said that many times in interview. And somebody asked him, hey, why were you pulling your rifle out if the creature was walking away? He says, well, I wasn't worried about that creature. It was the two others I heard moving around in the brush line that had me concerned. And Patty, if you take the size comparisons, and go back to this one, and you scale the rocks, that log is still there, by the way. You can go back to this very site this day and see where this was filmed. It looks quite a bit different. But all the size estimates from where they were, the average man on a horse, from some of the stuff that was close up, the estimates are anywhere between, on the low end, that Patty was 7'2", to the high end about 7'10". And if you take girth, if anybody knows anything about sizing and proportions, if you take a 5-foot tall man and make him 7 foot tall, he doesn't gain 30 pounds. He gains like 100 pounds. Like if you take something that's 6 foot tall, like a building, a car, anything, and you double its size, it doesn't double its weight. It like quadruples its weight. It's just the way it works when you make a bigger mass. So there are a lot of estimates that Patty was probably between, you hear on the low, oh, she had to have been 350 pounds. No, she was probably 450, 500 pounds of muscle. And from the reports I've got of the type 1s, she's a little one. She's little at 7'5", 500 pounds. When you hear things of these things, where people are on the second story of their house and they see eyes glowing in at them. No, they're not crawling up on the window. They're looking straight in. So that's how big the type 1s get. Luckily, they're a little more shy, they're a little more reserved, they're a lot more elusive, kind of like how mountain gorillas are. Like I said, there's a lot of analogs with ape species with these things, which there's a lot of theories of genetic manipulation that we're not going to go into, but there's a lot of stuff that's really odd that a lot of these species line up with the great apes. So when we move on down south, the type 2, the wood booger, really ugly, nasty, and you're probably like, wood booger? The first time I heard the term wood booger, I'm like, wood booger, is that like tree snot? Like, what's a wood booger? But everybody's heard the story, the boogeyman will get you, the booger man will get you, and down south, very much down south, going all through Texas and Alabama, all the way to Georgia and all the way on the East Coast, they describe something that looks a lot more chimpanzee-like. They tend to move around in bigger clans, bigger family groups. More of them are reported. And these things really like to screw with people. They like to, these are the ones that steal chickens. Not only do they steal chickens, but they'll open the chicken coop, steal a chicken, close the door, and relatch it. You hear a lot of crazy stuff. You hear they don't get the physiology of these guys, they don't get quite as big as the type 1s. A really big type 2 is probably 8 feet tall. They're not quite as big at the shoulders, not quite as bulky, but they're very vocal. They can be very aggressive. They can be very mean, very excitable, especially when you get a lot of younger teenage Sasquatches around, just like teenage boys, they can be a lot of trouble. And typically when you see a Bigfoot, it's not going to be an older Bigfoot in general. It's going to be a young one that's probably out looking for trouble, out cruising around, maybe on their own for the first time. Maybe when they get a little too older and a little too ornery, they get kicked out of their family group to go find their own way. So there's a lot of theories about that kind of stuff. But so when you think of a type 2, a wood booger, just think of down south. Think of everything from like Southern California, Arizona, all the way to like Florida. And that's pretty much what a wood booger. Think big, giant, mean, honking chimpanzee, really mean and aggressive. And if you're seeing some of the research that's coming out about chimpanzees, how they hunt other tribes and they hunt other monkeys and stuff like that, chimpanzees can be very, very nasty. So when you hear about these things being nasty, it kind of makes sense. Now, the type 3s are incredibly rare. They are pretty much between the Missouri River and the Mississippi River, going up in the Midwest, in the middle of North America, going on up into Canada. Now, what sets these guys apart is they have a snout. They're very rare here in the United States, but I guess I see a lot more of these things in Canada. They don't have family groups, they don't knock on trees, they don't do howls, they don't do any of the pretty Bigfoot stuff you've heard, they don't leave gifts for you. These are purely from what the Indians say, from what settlers have reported, from what modern day sightings have seen, from the people I've talked to, straight up carnivores. They have, now I'm not talking they have a snout like a dog, because that would be something else, because they have the body of a Bigfoot like a type 1, big powerhouse, normal knee, foot, general humanoid setup, but they have a protruding snout like a baboon. Think baboon or mandrill. And you ever seen those big fangs that, baboons have? So just think of that, but in a very carnivorous sense. There's reports of these things tearing apart black bears and hunters in the woods and missing areas. They're kind of a lone, solitary creature. If you're going to ask me for one candidate out of the Bigfoot world, there's a couple on this list that when you talk to the natives about it, they say shoot and ask questions later, or run away, or drive as fast as you can. These are the guys you want to stay away from. Here's a couple more pictures to kind of illustrate the point. They are pretty much the stuff nightmares are made out of. We tell kids monsters don't exist. Well, in certain parts of the country, they supposedly exist. Now, my Bigfoot interactions, thankfully in California with the shy type 1 creatures I believe we have, I'm glad we don't have these. These are incredibly rare, but people do report them. You get reports, you listen to Sasquatch Chronicles, you listen to World Bigfoot Radio with Duke, you read accounts, and people are like, yeah, it was 9 or 10 feet tall, I was up in a tree stand, or we were out hiking, or we saw this Bigfoot creature, but I don't know, it had a snout. And then when you're first getting into this, you're like, what? Yeah, like a baboon, or like a dog or a mandrill, it had a snout. And you're like, no. You must have saw it wrong, or you saw a bear or something. That's one of the nicknames for these things. They go by many names. People call him the bear man. No, not the dog man. We're going to talk about the dog man later, if any of you guys are familiar with that cryptid creature. They often get confused for the dog man, which has a more canine-like appearance. And, but these things, very nasty. Like I said, they're built like a type 1, but they have this snout, they have this fangs, they have a very mean reputation, and you definitely don't want to mess with them. And when a number of people start seeing something, people who don't know each other are describing something different, it's going on. One person sees something, you can dismiss them as crazy, but if 2 or 3 people see something, they're describing the same animal, they don't know each other in different areas, then you're onto something. And that's what's really fascinating about the cryptozoological world, cryptozoology, which is, cryptozoology is the study of hidden animals, zoology being animals and crypto being hidden. And like Steve was kind of alluding to, and some other people were talking about, there's a lot of crossover in the paranormal world. There's parapsychology, which is like telepathy and ESP and precognition and all that kind of stuff going on into like Ghostbuster stuff, where they go look for EVPs and I ain't afraid of no ghost, And then you look at the cryptozoological world, which is quite different. A cryptozoological professor will tell you, look, this is the study of hidden animals. We're not paranormal. We're not a parapsychology. Then you start getting into some of these weird stories about these things teleporting and flashing and cloaking, and you start getting off into the weeds, the woo as they call it, and there's a lot of bleed over in the middle. Where these things fit in, I don't know. But anyway, let's move on. Kind of went off on a tangent there. Well, it looks great on the laptop. I didn't know what we're going to be projecting it on. These lights here are kind of washing it out. Basically, you're looking at big giant fangs, big giant mouth open, the eyes are kind of sunk back in the head. You're looking at a large brow ridge. You're looking at a very protruding forehead. You're seeing a lack of a frontal lobe. If you want to get technical, that's pretty classic with Bigfoot. But you're looking at more of a snout of a bear-like creature. It looks terrible on here.
What is that on the left? Is that like the background?
No, that's the actual creature, the hair and everything on it. So.
Okay, all right.
Sorry. Yeah, he's hunched over all. He's all kind of funny. Yeah, he's a nasty boy. You don't want to mess with him. So the type 4s are very fascinating. Like I was alluding to earlier, these, for all intents and purposes, look a lot like a patty Bigfoot, where you're classic, 7, 8, 9, 10 foot tall, very broad shouldered, but they have a very human-like face, and a lot of times they describe a lack of facial hair. They have somewhere between, not like a sunken nose like you would see on an ape, but not quite a full protruding nose like a human being has. Somewhere kind of in the middle, like it got smashed by a book or something, And they call it the relic hominid type because there's a lot of theories in the Bigfoot world that some of you may have heard of Gigantopithecus. Some think that they may be offshoot of Neanderthals or Homo heidelbergensis, some of our really ancient ancestors. Homo heidelbergensis was they actually call it robustus because it had a very thick bone structure. And there's a lot of theories that this is where Bigfoot comes from. And like I said, if you look at the Patty Bigfoot, and say you could, wrestle Patty, you can, come here, take her and tackle her down to the ground, tranquilize her, whatever. And you were brave enough to shave Patty, shave all the hair off her face. It might look something like that. So there's a lot of conjecture if the type 4s, the relic hominid types that people see, and the type 1s are really one and the same. I think they're separate because the type 4s, especially in the Northeast especially has a lot of violent Bigfoot encounters. Like they're very mean there. And you hear a lot more aggressive encounters out of like a type 4 than say like a Patty type Bigfoot. But they could be one and the same. I would accept somebody's argument on that if you think they're different in your research, however you want to think. But just know that some are described as looking very ape-like and some are described more human-like. These are the more human-like ones. Now you got me all paranoid on what these slides are going to look like on this wall. The type 5 is what they call a Wendigo variety of Bigfoot. Now these seem to be somewhat related to the Gugwe or the type 3s in that they're purely carnivorous. Now these are purely carnivorous subalpine varieties. If you think of a type 1, a Patty type, as being a grizzly bear, these are polar bear. Now where grizzly bears can chase down and eat a deer or eat carrion and then go eat a bunch of berries, polar bears don't do that. They'll hunt humans, they kill things. They purely live off of meat, and that's essentially what a type 5 Wendigo is. I'm sure a lot of you especially have heard of a Wendigo, the more spiritual creature with the whole Wendigo psychosis, where if you get attacked by a Wendigo, you turn into one, and then you're all emaciated and you're always hungry, and you turn into a cannibal, and they're like a skull with deer antlers, this big horrible native tradition demon thing, for lack of a better term. Well, if you look at a lot of Native American cultures, especially even the Iroquois and a lot of the stuff, when they go back, when they talk about a Wendigo, they talk about two different things. And if there's a large creature out in the woods that's purely carnivorous, now one thing about a type 3 and a type 5, these Wendigos, is they have claws. They don't have fingernails, they have claws, from what reports say. People have seen them peeking out from behind a bush, and they see claws, and they see big fangs and massive incisors. So these things are incredibly rare. They like the subalpine. They like northern Minnesota. They like Canada. They like the areas with lots of snow and lots of cold, just like a polar bear. And like I said, these things are rare, but people do see them and they do encounter them. And then going along the East Coast, there's a kind of another little tradition we'll get into here. So here's some more pictures of kind of what they're like. They are just big, hulking, absolute monsters. Between these and a type 3, if I had to pick one, I don't know. They're both pretty scary. I just think the Wendigo has a cooler name than a Gugwi. But they have big claws. They get huge. They can run things down. They're at home in the cold. In my opinion, I do believe they would take people. The Native American cultures do believe that they take people. And there were a lot of the traditions of don't go out at night, hunters not coming back, come from these guys. Now, as we really get off into the weeds here, a offshoot of the Wendigo, have any of you guys ever heard of the Genoskwa? The Genoskwa, also known as the stone giants, if you look at their descriptions of how tall they are, they're not true giants, which we're going to get into. They are 7, 8, 9, 10 feet tall, typical Bigfoot sizes, but purely carnivorous, fangs, claws, tear people apart, hunters go missing. So that would be the Genoskwa, which is mainly an East Coast type of thing, going on down, kind of to the southern areas. And if you're kind of wondering, yes, a lot of these same different Bigfoot subspecies or whatever they are, we don't know if they're subspecies or whatever they are, different varieties do overlap and do inhabit the same area, just in case you guys are wondering. So there could be normal, and the Native Americans do talk about there being a normal type of Bigfoot and there being a Wendigo type Bigfoot that eats people. And when you get into the Genoskwa, the stone giants, what makes it so fascinating is they called them the stone giants. They also called them the shining ones. Now, that's not the shining ones like you guys might be thinking in the UFO world. What they called themselves that is they were known to have applique armor. What these Bigfoot with this carnivorous variety would do would go find tree sap and mud and go roll around in it, cover themselves in pitch. Then they would go roll around on a stony shore in the rocks, and they would have their fur all matted with all these rocks and stones. And that's where the stone giants, and as you see depicted here in the art. And why they would do that is it was great protection against spears and arrows, because back in the Native American days, it was all stones. It was all stones. It was all stone heads. It was obsidian. And you have great applique armor. If you can cover yourself in pitch, sap, whatever, and go roll around in a bunch of stones, you've got yourself some great armor against the Indians, and you can just go in there and take whatever you want and pillage and all that kind of stuff. So very fascinating. And you'll also know, and as soon as the white man showed up from Europe with our rifles, a lot of the stories of the Genoskwa went away, because the applique armor didn't work so well against lead balls coming out of a musket. So very fascinating. Like I said, the Wendigo, Genoskwa, kind of the same thing, just kind of regional varieties of a carnivorous Bigfoot with big fangs and claws. And that's going to take me to kind of not the end of the Bigfoot conversation, but we really start getting into some of these creatures. Like I said, this is 10 types of things that people report that are associated with the Sasquatch phenomenon that aren't necessarily a Bigfoot. And one of those things here is something called a mountain giant. Have any of you guys ever heard of mountain giants?
Red hair?
Actually, what's surprising is a lot of the mountain giants are not reported with red hair. The European variety of giants have red hair, which a lot of you guys are familiar with.
Green eyes, double row of teeth.
They do have double row teeth and green eyes, a pretty classic example of what you think of the Nephilim, of the giants. And there's a lot of theories we can get off in there too, especially when it comes into the dogmen and these guys. The good news about mountain giants is they are incredibly rare. They are in the deepest, darkest regions of Montana, the panhandle of Idaho, going into Canada. Apparently Alaska has them too. And some of the evidence you find for these guys is you'll find a lot of times rivers are great separations. On one side of the river, you'll see X tree structures, you'll find Sasquatch footprints, you'll find bedding sites, a lot of Sasquatch sign. And on the other side of the river, you don't find anything except for one giant tree this big turned upside down, uprooted, stuck into the ground. Well, mountain giant lives on that side, Bigfoot lives on that side. And the Native American traditions do have, where they talk about some of these areas, talking about these mountain giants. And they talk about teaming up with Bigfoots because these things eat humans, like giants are kind of known to do. They would take Native Americans, and they were very scared of them, and the Bigfoots were scared of them too. There's a Sasquatch researcher. Any of you guys ever heard of Kat Hansen? You should check her out. She's a Native American gal, very good. She's on a friend of mine's show, Duke, Brian Sullivan. I got to get him down here at some point to talk to you guys too, because he's way better at this than me. But she talks about the mountain giants being district managers, and she has some great pictures and great stories, and she talks about the different types of Bigfoots and dogmen and the gugwees and how nasty they are, and she's had personal contacts with them. She has a tribe of Bigfoots that she has contact with, and they talk about certain areas of the woods that these mountain giants are almost kind of they're not friendly, but they're kind of if Bigfoot start getting too close to people, if they start getting too vocal, if they start warring different clans and tribes or different varieties, they come in and break it up, often in a very violent way. There's some really famous stories in northern Montana of remote mining and construction sites where they would be mining and they would come out the next day and their F-350 truck or their tractor would have a boulder the size of a Volkswagen sitting on top of it, completely smashed. Or things tipped over, things that if you had a herd of Sasquatch, you couldn't do. And people do report, going way back in the middle of the woods, way back in the country, hiking, backpacking, they see something way off in the distance. And you got to think, am I looking at a Bigfoot, or an extremely large Bigfoot, or a smaller mountain giant? Well, just think of a Bigfoot as being built like a football player, being like the Incredible Hulk. Think of these guys as being built like a basketball player. They're a lot more streamlined, still very big, but they're not the big, giant, bulked out monsters you think of like the Incredible Hulk is with these guys. But they do get upwards of 20 feet tall. They have been known to wear very primitive clothing, to carry clubs. When you're 17 feet tall, you can just take any tree as a club, I guess. But they like to be left alone. They can be extremely dangerous, and they're extremely rare. And this is, like, say, going into Canada. Apparently, Alaska's loaded with them. I was in Alaska earlier this year, and I was like, is there a mountain giant up here? All I saw was a lot of moose. So very beautiful, by the way. Ever been to Alaska? They do not have a water shortage up there, I'll tell you that. I was there for 10 days. It rained every day, all day long. And they have rivers that are like 400 or 500 yards wide going into another river. And you're like, can we have some of this water down here in California? So mountain giants, we could talk all night about them. There's a lot of stuff online. It's kind of coming out. Because every now and then people would have a Sasquatch encounter. And they're like, yeah, man, it was really, really big, but it looked more human-like and was a little more slender and was 15 feet tall. People are like, that's not a Sasquatch you're talking about. So that's kind of why mountain giants get grouped into here. So to kind of swing to the other end of things, everybody's favorite state, you turn on the news and there's some kind of hillbilly doing something. It's always from Florida.
Which tribe is Kat Hansen from?
I think I'm trying to remember what tribe she's from. I know it's somewhere, some northern Midwest tribe up there, the Minnesota area. So yeah, something like that, or Iroquois or something up there, I'm not exactly sure. If she was here, she'd be hitting me on the back of the head. And she says, so anyway, going to everybody's favorite state for mishaps is Florida. How many people here have heard of a skunk ape? Everybody's heard of a skunk ape. Really terrible odor. But what's fascinating about Florida is Florida has the type 2s, the wood boogers, the big excitable chimpanzees. They see those there. But they have, of course, Florida's got to be different. They have their kind of own variety. of what they call a skunk ape, which looks, remember like I said, a lot of these, some look like a chimpanzee, some look like a gorilla. Well, these look a lot like an orangutan, which is very odd. These pictures are the famous Mayaka skunk ape photos taken from 2003, I believe, of an older retired lady in her backyard. She says, this thing keeps coming around and stealing fruit out of my garden. And she'd snap pictures of it, and there was a letter that she actually included to the local sheriff. And if you take the average size of palm trees, and from what the description she was saying, she said this thing was about 7.5 feet tall. Because there's a lot of conjecture, it was an escaped orangutan. Orangutans don't get 7.5 feet tall. They don't walk upright. But it's very fascinating that if you look the way it's smiling and showing its teeth, those are two separate photos. There's a close-up of its face. It's smiling. You can see it's kind of lower teeth kind of fangs, which orangutans really don't have that big of fangs coming out of them. And in the primate world, if you smile, if you ever come across a Bigfoot, don't smile, because you're showing your teeth. It's a sign of aggression. No, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't make eye contact. So this lady came out in the middle of the night with her camera, probably a broom in one hand. Herb, whatever, it's back, And she's in there watching TV, I'm sure. No one believes her until there's a skunk ape in her backyard. And what's really fascinating is if you look at the length of the arms on some of these photos, like you can really see it right through there coming on down. And if you look really closely, it's really hard on this background. I didn't pick the background, sorry. But you can see where its arm extends way down to the bottom of the picture, and you look at how big it is hunched there in the palmettos. This thing standing upright, she said, was close to 7 feet tall. Absolutely fascinating. These are just some great pictures. It's accompanied by a letter. Check out the Mayaka skunk ape, Mayaka, Florida. Now, that's not to say that in other parts of Florida they don't have the type 2s, like I said. I think there's different regions of them, different variants. But it is very fascinating, almost like there's some genetic tampering in the Bigfoot world, that some look like an ape, some look like a chimpanzee, some look like a baboon, some look like a yeti in North America, but carnivorous, some look like an orangutan in Florida, of all places. So what brings me on to the type 8s, which I classify as a type 8, because it's something else, like I said, that not necessarily a Bigfoot, but people reporting the Bigfoot phenomenon. And these are called devil monkeys. They look like an cross between an overgrown baboon and a dog. People see them in the Southwest. People see them on the East Coast. Every now and then someone says, yeah, I saw this thing run across the desert or run across the road, or they got a good look at it, and they're like, well, it wasn't an escaped baboon. It was way, way too big. Or, well, it wasn't a Bigfoot because it was kind of down on all fours, but it wasn't a gugwee, or it wasn't a dog man. And in the Southwest, the natives do have traditions of this devil monkey. And there's a lot of conjecture if this is maybe where some of the chupacabra stuff comes from. I don't know if they're carnivorous, but I don't know, for some reason these things just kind of scare the hell out of me. I'd just be walking along like, Here's kind of some more pictures, kind of some different things going on here to give you more of a size. But what you would expect with a kind of like a wild, feral, overgrown monkey, but more like a gorilla size. Very fascinating. People do see these things, so if you hear someone saying it was running around on all fours and it had a tail, that's a big tip-off, and had more of a snout and teeth and looked kind of like a baboon and a dog cross, but it was on all fours, well, they're probably talking about a devil monkey. So to get to and I refer to that as a type 8, a devil monkey. This is my classification system. If you say, I saw a type 8 Bigfoot to someone else who doesn't know my work, they're going to look at you and go, what you talking about? So this is just for me, and this all started years ago before I ever really started a YouTube channel or talked to people. I'd listen to encounters, I'd listen to reports, I'd read things, and I had the 4 basic types. I actually had notes in my phone, and I was like, okay, well, what's a devil monkey then? Well, what's a mountain giant? Well, where does a skunk ape fit in all this? And it's the human brain, we have to try to classify things, and I'm a little OCD with that kind of stuff. So for me, it was very easy to just start breaking these down. Well, let's just put a number to them. We already have 1 to 4 gun. Hey, my list is already halfway down. We already have number 4. So the other thing, how many of you guys have heard of the Ohio Grassman? Ohio is one of the most populated states with the most amount of woods out there, and they have an absolute gigantic amount of Bigfoot reports come out of Ohio every year. They also have a lot of other really strange creatures. I was telling Steve the other day, Steve Maria, the guy who was up here, about some of the strange things that they see in Ohio, and he was like, no way. They see some strange things in Ohio. So not only do they have type 1 Bigfoots, not only do they have type 2 Bigfoots, maybe in the lower ends of it, and maybe even a gugwe in some of the more reported parts, but they also see the dogman creature, which we're going to hit on later, which isn't a type of Bigfoot but deserves a dishonorable mention. But what they have is their very own unique thing called the Grassman. And they're human-sized. They're like a dark-skinned, feral, wild people. There's been reports of these over the years. There's been actual video of these things where they're like, people just like, driving along the highway like, is that a human? I don't know. They're not wearing any clothes. They look hairy, but they're not big like a Bigfoot. They look like just a wild, dark-skinned person covered in hair running around in the bush. And there'll be 3 or 4 of them reported out there, some kind of a feral community. So that's what I report as a type 9. The only place I've ever heard of these specific creatures existing is in Ohio. If there are other places, I don't know. But what really gets me is that they're a very human size. They're not very much taller than us, not very much smaller, but they're almost like some kind of a feral human, like some kind of tribe. And there are reports of tribes that live off in the woods by themselves, but I don't know what you call these things. People report them now and then. I don't know about this. I know Ohio, if you look at the terrain and the reports, they got every kind of Bigfoot and dogman, and they have something called the Loveland frog. That's really out there. It's a giant frog that walks around that people see. Yeah. Yeah. And that kind of leads me into maybe these guys are related to what I call a type 10, which is the little people, or if you guys have ever heard of a pukwudgie. Now, these guys are 1 to 3 foot tall, little hairy creatures, known to be very aggressive little tricksters. Interesting here in Southern California, in Ortega Highway, down in Orange County where I am, there are reports of over the years of a small 1 to 2 foot tall little hairy guy running across the road in the middle of the night of Ortega Highway. And campers seeing these things and having stuff stolen out of their coolers. And if you go on down south to San Diego, there's the infamous Zuby's case where they do see Bigfoots down in San Diego, and they do see Bigfoots in the deserts and stuff. But this is something, I don't know, these really freak me out too, because there's these small, little, violent little guys, and there's all these really out there reports of people out there looking for regular Bigfoots have run into these things where they've come across almost like a portal in the woods, and these things kind of come out of nowhere, almost like they're guarding something. And if you go all the way on up to Vancouver, British Columbia, a friend of mine, also a Sasquatch guy, Tom Seawood, very cool guy. He's a member of the Kwakwaka'Ewak Indian tribe. And he was telling us about the Pacific Northwest and some of their traditions, and they have 2 very separate Sasquatch traditions. One is what they call the Zuniqua, which is the wild woman of the wood or the wild man of the woods. The Zuniqua, the wild woman of the woods, has a wicker basket, and they're known to abduct kids that stay out at night. That's kind of like their boogeyman story in their tribe. Oh, don't stay out at night, the boogeyman will get you, or you're skipping school and smoking cigarettes, oh, the Zuniqua will get you. And it's depicted in their art as carrying children off and taking them back to eat them. And that's the Zuniqua, and that's their tradition of, like, for all intents and purposes, a type 1 Bigfoot, which they have quite a few up there, as you can imagine, in a lush rainforest-like environment. But they also have another tradition called the Bakwis. And the Bakwis are like what we're describing, little 1, 2, 3 foot tall, little hairy guys that run around in the woods. And the natives talk about, they see Bigfoot all the time. That would be like seeing a bear in Bigfoot, or in Big Bear. Like, yeah, they're up there. And I guess the tribes go generations without ever actually seeing the Bakwis. I guess it's very rare, and it's a very incredible, they count it as a spiritual experience if they see one of these little ones, one of these little mischievous guys. But their signs are everywhere. They see little tiny drawing on rocks, or things turned over in their campsite. Apparently they love garlic, and I guess Bigfoot does too. I guess Bigfoots are garlics. It's one of the things that Tom Seawood does, is he brings cloves of garlic and hangs them from trees, because I guess Bigfoot likes garlic. They didn't smell bad enough. They need garlic, huh? But it's just really interesting are the pukwudgies, which are these kind of really nasty little creatures that go back on the East Coast. I just did a video on them, and they're known to carry spears and bows and be kind of think some kind of a gnome or some kind of a forest-like creature, to be kind of more bordering on paranormal, supernatural, and they abduct people, or they paralyze them, or they put spells on people, or they curse people. And that's kind of the puck-wedgie end of it. But once again, we have a phenomenon of all across the United States, people are seeing this small little hairy thing. Very rarely, but people are reporting it, like we were saying. And I pretty much classify it type 10. I just put a video out on this yesterday on my YouTube channel. And the little people and puckwudgies are very hard because there's so little known about them. Like, there's a million podcasts on regular Bigfoots and on Dogman and on the Gugwies even, and even mountain giants is starting to get out there. There's a lot of people reporting, and there's a lot of histories. But when you start talking about the Littlefoot or the little people or puckwudgies, there's not a lot known. I mean, people see them, but yeah, very creepy. So that's the 10 basic types. And I told you guys about a dishonorable mention, the Dogman. Not a Bigfoot. If any of you guys ever heard of the Rougarou? Of course you have, Tustin. If you guys ever heard of the Beast of Bray Road? The Beast of Bray Road, okay, someone's heard of the Beast of Bray Road. The Rougarou, the Beast of Bray Road, the Michigan Dogman, people are seeing something not unlike what you would describe as a werewolf. And in the last few years, the Dogman has gotten incredibly popular. There are whole podcasts and shows and people researching this thing. And if we're going to go as far as to say, yeah, Bigfoot can exist, or I saw something. And what really fascinates everybody about the Dogman is, for a Bigfoot, okay, we have a fossil record if you're into science. We have many upright walking apes. We are one of them. We have other great ape species. We have chimpanzees and bonobos and orangutans and the apes, and us, we're part of the great ape species. We have Gigantopithecus. We have everything going back from Homo habilis to Homo erectus to Homo heidelbergensis to Neanderthals to Cro-Magnons to Homo sapiens sapiens and Homo sapiens, modern day humans, correct humans. So there's a lot of stuff in the fossil record that would support a Bigfoot. And if you look at Gigantopithecus, which is an extinct ape that was very, very large, there's a lot of support that, well, yeah, Bigfoot could exist. Nowhere in the fossil record is there an upright walking canine. It is the very odd phenomenon. Now, the Eastern European traditions of the werewolf, you get bit by a werewolf and then you go and howl at the moon and you transform and you're a crappy Michael J. Fox movie from the 80s. Running around London. That's a very Eastern European tradition that has a lot more to do with witchcraft and a lot more to do with that kind of end of things and curses and family bloodlines. What the Dogman are is anybody's guess, but people report all across the USA, the Border Patrol agents, if you guys know who Rocky Elmore is, he's a retired Border Patrol agent, they saw these things all the time. And that was one of the jokes in the Bigfoot world, is build the wall to keep the Dogman out. Because there's tons of reports of immigrants going Lobos, running up to the Border Patrol agents, and they'd see a pack of these huge wolf-like creatures out in the middle of the desert that were chasing the immigrants and then suddenly would start walking upright. In fact, in very remote parts of Mexico, there's even the dogs of war, which is a family curse, where you'll be cursed to see these things and they'll follow you around. A lot of the Native American traditions talk about the Dogman. If you go down to the Choctaw and Chickasaw in Mississippi, in those areas, they talk about Bigfoot and the Dogman, these large canine creatures battling each other for territory. To them, it's a very real creature. And every Native American I've ever seen, they say, oh, Bigfoot, spiritual animal, you leave them alone, they leave you alone. They're the king of the woods. They talk about Dogman to a lot of natives, and they're like, shoot them on sight. They're evil. So, but like I said, it's very, and they even break down Dogman into different types too. Some look more like a hyena, some look more like a wolf just standing up, some have very broad shoulders. There seems to be some variance of how big these things get. But the Dogman is one of those things that people do see across the nation. They've been seen in Sacramento in California. They've been seen out in the Anza Borrego Desert out here in California. They've been seen in Palm Desert. They've seen all across the border, all across Arizona, Texas, down south of Rougarou, going all the way up to the Michigan Dogman. These things in the last few years. In fact, I talked to a lady a couple weeks ago. I just did a whole video on it on my channel. She had a Dogman report from Wyoming, which I thought was way too far north for where people are seeing these things. And she was 10, 12 years old in the station wagon, were going down the road with her parents, going on a weekend drive kind of thing in the 70s before Dogman was in the vernacular. She thought it was a Bigfoot until she heard what a Dogman was. And this upright, 6.5 to 7 foot tall, looked like a wolf with broad shoulders with that kind of, you know how humans have a normal knee and dogs have that extended forepaw that kind of comes up and then they have a knee in the front? Well, Dogman is described as having that kind of, as you can see in the picture on the left, they're described as having that kind of extended forepaw that almost acts like a knee in the back with a knee in the front, but standing upright. Very weird. And if you look at, like I said, the European traditions, the Native American traditions, the Mexican traditions going back, and you look at like Anubis in Egypt, and all over the world, even Australia, all these places, they're reporting something like an upright walking dog. And when you get into Dogman, you can do whole talks about this. There's a lot of different subjects and theories, but the Dogman seems to have two very separate things going on. One is a physical creature. They report little ones, big ones, yipping and howling, running in packs. There are people in the South that say, oh yeah, we know what those things are, but we don't talk about them. They come through, they're here for a couple weeks, and then they move on, they migrate. And they talk about them being a real creature. They just can walk on all fours, and they can stand and walk upright, and they're very terrifying. And they talk about it being, like I said, a real creature. They hunt, they move, they do their business. And then there's reports of something else with the Dogman, of people like shooting at them, of people like unloading on them with high caliber rifles and having no effect, and glowing red eyes and vanishing before their eyes, something very supernatural. There's a lot of conjecture on what, is that a demon? Is that a ghost? Is that your mind playing tricks on you? Is it a hologram? What is the difference between this very physical creature that people can shoot, interact with, I suggest you don't interact with, and some kind of another spiritual type creature that looks the same? There's a lot more mystery even in the Dogman world than there is in the Bigfoot world. Here's a track, and if you can see, that's about 7 inches long. You can go into territory, especially down south. They don't really have wolves, and I suppose they have domestic dogs. But one thing that you kind of notice that's very fascinating by reported Dogman tracks is they're a little like similar to a dog, but a little more elongated, because you think if they're standing upright, they would need to balance a little better. So I just thought I would show that in there for scale. So if you're ever out in the woods and you hear a howl, that's maybe the coyotes shut up when they hear that howl, and you're like, we don't have wolves around here. Or you hear stories of like, yeah, man, it had to have been a 250-pound wolf in California. You're like, because they are reported to walk on all fours too. So just beware if someone says they're seeing an upright walking dog, they're probably not crazy. Well, they might be. But people see them all over the United States, especially in the more southern regions, and it's a real thing. The natives have talked about it for a long time. There's traditions all over the world. The Dogman is a very real thing. So the next slide, I was kind of hoping that somebody would have a laser pointer so I could talk a little bit more about, excuse me. I wish this was whiskey. Talk a little bit more about where these creatures actually live. Now, if you see the big cluster on the left, it's California going on up to the Pacific Northwest. That's your type 1 territory. That's what we got here. Everybody okay? But then you kind of see that break in Southern California down there where those 3 big dots are. And that's kind of LA County going through there. And then you get into San Diego County, and those 2 other big red dots are the Idlewild Mountain Range and then Big Bear. And I think down there you have more of like a type 2, a wood booger type. Steve's been working with Claudia Ackley, who had a sighting and filmed one in Big Bear. And she described it as being very human-like, like a type 4, which I find very fascinating. Then going all through Arizona, northern Arizona, and most people don't associate Arizona with having woods, but northern Arizona, the Grand Canyon area, has got tons of elk, deer, lots of trees, very lush environment. You wouldn't expect it in northern Arizona. They have red rock and all these pine trees, quite beautiful. But they have their monster known as the Mogollon monster, the Mogollon rim. Very cool, but they seem to be like a derivative of like a type 2. Going on down into Texas, now if you see, West Texas has a few, New Mexico gets them now and then, Colorado obviously, all through the Rockies. You'd expect the Rockies to have Bigfoots. But then you get into East Texas. East Texas is one of the biggest hotspots in the nation. The Sam Houston National Forest, that whole area is very woodsy, very pines. It's kind of where the deserts meet the pine trees, because there's a little more hills and a little more topography going on there, because most of Texas is very flat. and it kind of starts going on over into like Alabama and then Arkansas up north and everything. And it's very heavily wooded, and they have so many Bigfoot reports, lots of Dogman reports. They're all dedicated groups. That's all they do is East Texas. And if you want to go there, there's a lot of Bigfoot reports. They're very active. They're known to be very aggressive there too. A lot of missing people from that area, which if you've looked at David Pilotti's Missing 411 map and you superimpose it over the Bigfoot map, it's quite telling and quite striking that a lot of missing people are going missing in Bigfoot territory, especially in Yosemite. Don't go to Yosemite. And you see you see all through the South, and then you go to Florida. I mean, look at Florida. It's a big red blob, you know? It's Florida, so we can just dismiss about 30% of the people as being crazy, but then you still have 70% of the people who are actually seeing something. And like I said, Florida, they kind of have this mix. They have probably the type 2 wood boogers, real chimpanzees running around in the bushes, and then they have, you know, that orangutan type that people are seeing. And that orangutan type is only seen in Florida, which is quite fascinating. Then you kind of go on up the East Coast, and that's where you start getting your regular Bigfoot traditions. They see a lot of type 4s up and down the East Coast, and kind of going inland towards the Great Lakes, but more along the New England area. You get a lot of type 4s. That's your Genosqua area, where it seems to be a little more temperate variation of the Wendigo, which reported to be more like a subalpine type variety. And that kind of takes you into the Great Lakes areas, kind of goes all through there. Then you see like where the Appalachian Trail is and going through there in eastern United States. There's just a ton of them. It's just always amazing how many encounters you hear from non-Bigfoot people from like Pennsylvania or Ohio or Michigan or someplace where they're like, well, I saw a 7-foot or 8-foot tall hairy thing run across the road, but I'm not in the Pacific Northwest. Well, it's a worldwide phenomenon, and they're all over the United States. And they seem to be kind of broken down into regions, but like I said, there is a lot of overlaps. If you saw a type 2 farther north, I wouldn't be shocked. If you saw a dogman up in Canada, I wouldn't be shocked. Some seem to be very localized. Kind of in the center there, just to the left of the Great Lakes, that's where you get into your Gugwe area, kind of the Missouri River basin between the Missouri and the Mississippi, right where they kind of come in, and then going on up to Canada. I was really hoping for a laser pointer. I have a 2-year-old. I think she stole it. I was running around the house looking for a laser pointer. She likes to chase the cats around, and I was trying to figure it out. And I have one of those temperature guns with the laser on it, but I'm like, that's too dorky, so I didn't bring that. But anyway, I was really hoping someone had a laser pointer. But yeah, and like I said, if you look across the other states, except for Nevada, they set off too many nuclear bombs. They don't have Bigfoots there. But yeah, and you see like North Dakota, South Dakota, the northern parts of Montana. Trust me, those areas are loaded with Bigfoots, especially northern Montana, because that's the northern Montana going into North Dakota, going on up into Canada. That's where you get your mountain giants going on up there. And a lot of those areas, like I said, where you don't see the big red dots, well, it's because there's just not a lot of people in those areas. So that's pretty much it in conclusion about the 10 types. It's kind of my own little personal list. Steve called me up the other day, and I was kind of racking my brain about what kind of presentation should I come talk to you guys about. And I've been on podcasts, and this is nice because I always get accused of interrupting people on podcasts, which is true, I do that. And this is nice, is I don't have anybody to interrupt. Because I always have some big grand point I want to make, and by the time they get to me, I usually forget it. So this has been nice talking to you folks. But, well, that certainly cures away no find very little of their scat. I figured for you UFO people, you know. I did a whole video on Bigfoot scat a while back, and it was very, very, very interesting. Just think human, but big, big. So I believe everything is possible. I don't throw it out. If I'm willing to believe in an upright walking alien, or upright walking hominid species, and I'm willing to believe aliens, I'll tell you a little personal story. This was 2011 when I had my first Bigfoot encounter. We'll sum it up. I was out hunting with my brother-in-law. We were coyote hunting. I was not really hunting, I just went along with him. He's the coyote hunter. I honestly do not care about shooting a coyote, but we were in the middle of the woods. This is my father-in-law's property in the Sierras. We have our hunting licenses, and we go off, and we're all painted up, and we have, we're all painted up in camouflage, and we're all decked out, and we got, cover scent on us and all that stuff. And I had a rock the size of a basketball whiz by my head, and growling, and something paced me out of the woods, which I'm convinced this day was a Bigfoot, because who's stupid enough to throw a rock at two guys with AR-15s in the middle of the woods? And there was a lot of brush behind me and stuff, and I heard it sounded like something small going through the bush, and just whoosh whizzed over my head. And my brother-in-law popped up and said, "I'm out of here," and he took off. And I'm like, "Yeah." And I had a little flashlight on my AR-15 because I'm so tactical, and we're kind of like looking behind us, and we could hear footsteps following us, and it was a weird night. So anyway, later on that night, we're back at the property, we're on the porch, we're having a couple beers, and we got a campfire going, and we're kind of trying to put that out of our mind. I think I got some music going. We have every porch light, every light in the house is on at that point. And we're sitting there having a beer, and we're looking off the porch, and 200 yards away, off in the very thick tree line behind a barbed wire fence, there is an orb of light. Something the size of a beach ball, this dull yellow light, just silently moving from our right to our left. It almost looked like somebody with a headlamp, but it wasn't, because it was just moving too silently, and you could see it go behind trees, and you could see it go in front of trees. And I know that area was super brushy and thick. You couldn't pay me money to go through there because it was all stickers and briars and everything else. And after having a rock thrown at us and being trailed out, we're kind of on our porch going like, "Well, what is that?" And he's like, "It's a reflection from the road." I'm like, "No, the road's over there. It's Bender's house." I'm like, "No, there's a big hill in front of there." And my brother-in-law, he's very straight. He's like, "Well, I don't know what it is, Matt. Maybe it's a firefly." I'm like, from 200 yards away, the size of a beach ball. And it just kind of silently moved through the bush. And I've heard lots of stories of people seeing these orbs of light out Bigfooting. Now, there's a lot of theories on what these orbs are. Lots of people see them. Some people think that they're a Native American spirit. One of my personal theories is that maybe it's somebody remote viewing, and that's their disembodied soul floating around. Yeah, right. And or it's there's some reports of higher consciousness ETs just being to the point where they're just a ball of light. I've heard that from other reports. There's different levels. You guys are UFO people, not me. There's different level of extraterrestrials, and some of them are such at a high level that they're just a ball of plasma light consciousness, and maybe that's what they are. Some of them think they're some kind of a drone, and there's a lot of what?
Swamp gas.
Yeah, swamp gas. And there's a lot of stories about these orbs in particular, and the Bigfoot topic kind of gets into these orbs because people see a lot of these in the same areas. Anza Borrego, which I was talking about, which is a state park east of San Diego, is a big desert area, and they have a history of the ghost lights of Anza Borrego where they see these orbs at night. You can still go see them. In fact, there's a very famous train derailment that killed the conductor and 3 other people. And in 1978, there was a train that went through a freight train, and he saw one of these orbs of light coming the other way on the track, and he thought it was an oncoming train. It's a true story. So he pulled the brake, but he did it on a curve over a trestle bridge, and the whole train went off. A couple of cars stayed on, but everything went over the side of the bridge and killed him. And so the ghost lights of Anza Borrego, people see these things. You spend enough time in the woods, you see a lot of odd things. Now, to get to your UFO question, one of the theories that has been proposed about Bigfoot is that they're an offshoot of the Nephilim. That's a very common thing going out, that there's very biblical thing. There's a lot of theories out there that copper, because a lot of the ancient giants and Nephilim species were being battled by copper blades, copper spearheads, copper arrows, and it has some kind of an effect against them. But I've also heard a report, and I don't disbelieve this, and I don't necessarily believe this. I do think that Bigfoot and Dogman and these other varieties seem a little too engineered. Like, why would we have one that looks like a chimpanzee and one that looks like a gorilla and one that looks like an orangutan? That seems a little too put together for just to be a natural animal if you believe in evolution or creation or whatever you want to say. There's a theory that Bigfoots were bred by an extraterrestrial race, or maybe us from the future or the past, or there's all sorts of theories on that. You guys know more about that than me, as some kind of a slaver workforce. If you were going to make the perfect worker, it would probably be like a Bigfoot, 8, 9, 10 foot tall, 800 pounds, able to hunt and feed themselves, but be great for building the pyramids and stacking big blocks and doing all the construction type stuff you need. That'd be a Bigfoot. Then I've heard theories that the Dogman was, if Bigfoot were the laborers, I've heard the Dogman were the warriors. They were bred to protect the pyramids and all the other great stuff, and that's where these two races of Dogman and different species of Bigfoot came about as laborers and protectors. And then there's other theories that the Dogman was bred to take out the Nephilim and giants, and that's why they're so ferocious. And anyway, so yes, I have heard a lot of alien connections. I've heard reports of people who were abducted or have had contact with ETs, that they've seen Bigfoot-like creatures on board. There are out there reports of where, yeah, man, I thought I was losing my stuff. I saw a UFO, and I saw it land in a field over there, and what came out of it was a Bigfoot, not a little green guy or a big tall gray guy or a reptoid or whatever. So yes, I have heard UFO reports with Bigfoot. Is there some bigger conspiracy, something we don't understand about them being genetically modified by creatures or other civilizations? Who knows? I've also heard reports from special forces operators who have been sent in to take out rogue Bigfoots around the country. They get a clan, they get an individual who starts sniffing around people, start getting too aggressive, and missing 411 kind of stuff. And they'll actually send in special forces to go eliminate these guys. And I have heard reports that there are different varieties, and they know about the different varieties, and the government does know about Bigfoot and the different types, and they describe some as being true bloods, and they design some as being genetically tampered with. And there's also other theories about Bigfoot, some being like a very true blood variety that have been here for thousands of years. And then you have the Gugwi with the snout and the fangs and everything that maybe the government or another species or somebody engineered them to be that much more ferocious. Like I said, that's getting way off into the weeds. But to answer your question, yes, the UFO Bigfoot stuff does cross over quite a bit. And so does the paranormal world. Because people report Bigfoots with glowing red eyes and disappearing or cloaking or getting a very immense sense of dread or being very demonic-like sometimes, a Bigfoot. So it kind of crosses over into a lot of these other worlds. Everything okay, Steve?
Yeah, no, everything's great.
You going to get the big hook? Yeah.
First of all,